Let me ask you something that's going to make you slightly uncomfortable. The last time someone told you, "I'm fine," were they actually fine? Think about it. Think about the way their shoulders pulled inward, the way their voice dropped just half a tone lower than usual, the way their eyes didn't quite meet yours before they looked away. You felt it, didn't you? That electric whisper in your gut that said something is off, even though every word coming out of their mouth told you nothing was wrong. That feeling, that's not intuition. That's not a gift. That's your brain doing exactly what it was built to do over 2 million years of human evolution, and you've been ignoring it your entire life. Here's the truth nobody tells you. Every single person you encounter is constantly leaking their real thoughts, feelings, and intentions. Not occasionally, not when they're nervous, constantly, through the micro-tension in their jaw, through the half-second expression that crosses their face before they remember to control it, through the way their body inches backward even as they lean their head forward to seem engaged, through the slight rise in vocal pitch when they're stretching the truth. The average person misses 95% of this information every single day. But a small group of people, negotiators, therapists, detectives, elite salespeople, the most magnetic leaders in every room, have trained themselves to catch it all. And the gap between them and everyone else isn't talent. It isn't a sixth sense. It's knowledge. Specific, learnable, scientifically grounded knowledge about how human beings work. That's what this book is. In the chapters ahead, you're going to discover the hidden architecture of human behavior. You're going to learn to read faces in a fraction of a second, decode body language clusters that reveal what people won't say, detect the subtle vocal shifts that expose confidence from bluster and honesty from deception. You'll understand how to establish behavioral baselines, how to read across cultural lines without getting burned, how to apply these skills in job interviews, negotiations, dating, parenting, leadership, and every high-stakes conversation you'll ever have. And by the final page, you'll never look at another person the same way again. Let's begin. The wiring underneath. Understanding why people leak the truth before you can decode anyone. You need to understand why decoding is even possible. Why do human beings reveal so much without intending to? Why can't we simply decide to hide what we're feeling and make it stick? The answer is buried in our evolutionary history, and it explains everything. The tribal brain. You're still using roughly 200,000 years ago. Your ancestors lived in groups of 50 to 150 people on the African savanna. In those groups, the ability to read other people wasn't a social nicety. It was a survival mechanism. You needed to know, within seconds, whether the stranger approaching your camp was dangerous or safe, whether the alpha male in your group was about to erupt in rage or was in a generous mood, whether your hunting partner was genuinely committed or about to bail when things got hard. The people who were wrong about these readings died or were cast out, which amounted to the same thing. The people who read correctly survived, thrived, and passed their neural wiring down through the generations, down to you. Your brain today contains an extraordinarily sophisticated social processing system, one that operates almost entirely below the level of conscious thought. Every second you spend in the presence of another human being, your brain is tracking their facial micro-movements, their postural shifts, the rhythm of their breathing, the temperature and color of their skin, the dilation of their pupils, the cadence of their voice. It's processing thousands of data points and synthesizing them into what you experience as a feeling about a person. The problem is, for most people, that information never makes it past the filter of conscious awareness. It stays underground, manifesting as vague gut feelings that get dismissed as irrational, or worse, as anxiety that you can't quite explain. This book is about pulling that processing into the light. Principle 1. Emotions are physical events. The single most important concept in reading people is this: emotional states create predictable, involuntary physical changes in the body. When a person experiences fear, their adrenal glands flood their bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline. Their heart rate accelerates. Their breathing becomes shallow and rapid. The muscles around their eyes tighten. Their pupils dilate to take in more visual information. Their hands may tremble almost imperceptibly. Their voice rises in pitch as the vocal cords tense. None of this is a choice. It's the autonomic nervous system doing its job, preparing the body to fight, flee, or freeze. And crucially, it cannot be fully suppressed through willpower alone. This is why polygraphs work on a conceptual level. Even if their legal reliability is contested, they measure the physical cascades triggered by the stress of deception. But you don't need a machine. Once you know what to look for, your eyes are more sensitive than any instrument. The same principle holds for every major emotional state. Anger triggers a specific constellation of physical changes. So does joy, sadness, contempt, attraction, and surprise. These constellations are universal, meaning they appear consistently across all human cultures, from a boardroom in Chicago to a marketplace in Nairobi to a fishing village in rural Japan. The expressions may be suppressed at different rates depending on cultural norms, but the underlying physiology is identical. Principle 2. Everyone has a baseline. Here's something the movies get wrong about reading people. It's not about spotting a single suspicious gesture and declaring someone a liar. Real behavioral analysis is subtler and far more reliable than that. Every person has what behavioral scientists call a baseline, their normal, comfortable, relaxed pattern of behavior. How quickly they talk, how much they gesture, how directly they hold eye contact, how open or closed their posture tends to be, their default breathing rhythm, their typical facial expression at rest. Deviations from this baseline, not the absolute behaviors themselves, are where the real information lives. Consider two people walking into a job interview. Person A is naturally gregarious, loud, and constantly moving his hands when he talks. Person B is naturally quiet, still and measured. If both of them suddenly become rigid and still when you ask about a gap in their employment history, that's significant for Person A, because it's a dramatic departure from his baseline. For Person B, it might mean nothing at all. That's just how he normally is. Context-blind analysis is one of the most common and dangerous mistakes in behavior reading. We'll return to it throughout this book. Principle 3. Clusters, not singles. The third foundational principle is simple. Never interpret a single signal in isolation. Crossed arms do not mean defensiveness. Avoiding eye contact does not mean lying. A forced smile does not mean dislike. Each of these signals has dozens of potential explanations, depending on context, culture, temperature, physical comfort, and individual personality. What you're looking for is clusters, multiple behavioral signals that all point in the same direction simultaneously. When you see someone whose arms are crossed, whose body is angled away from you, whose voice has dropped in energy, whose responses have become shorter, and whose eyes keep drifting toward the exit, that cluster is telling you something clear and important. The more signals in a cluster that align, the more confidence you can place in your reading. Principle 4. The leakage hierarchy. Not all behavioral channels are equally controllable. Understanding which channels people can most easily suppress and which they can't tells you where to direct your attention. At the top of the control hierarchy is verbal content. Words are the most consciously managed channel. People choose their words deliberately, especially in high-stakes situations. Below that is vocal tone. Harder to control because it's produced by muscles we don't actively think about, and it shifts automatically with emotional state. Harder still to control is body language, particularly the lower half of the body. Interestingly, people trying to manage their nonverbal signals tend to focus almost entirely on their face and upper body, leaving the legs and feet almost completely unguarded. The feet, in fact, are often the most honest part of the human body, and at the bottom of the control hierarchy, the most impossible to fully suppress, are micro-expressions. The involuntary, split-second facial expressions that flash across the face before conscious control can intervene. We'll dedicate the entire next chapter to these. The principle here: the further down the leakage hierarchy you look, the more unfiltered the truth you'll find. Principle 5. Context is king. Every behavioral signal must be interpreted within its context. The same physical behavior carries entirely different meanings depending on the environment, the relationship between people, the cultural background, the time of day, the emotional tenor of the situation, and what happened 5 minutes before. A person pacing back and forth in an airport might be burning nervous energy before a flight. The same behavior in a hospital waiting room tells a very different story. Someone laughing loudly at a party is probably genuinely enjoying themselves. The same laughter after a funeral eulogy needs a completely different interpretation. Throughout this book, context will serve as the lens through which every observation gets filtered. Develop this habit. Before you interpret anything you observe, ask yourself, what else could explain this, given where we are and what's happening? Now let's go deeper into the face itself, where the most intimate truths hide in plain sight. The face doesn't lie. Micro-expressions and the 7 windows to the soul. Your face contains 43 muscles. Most of them are connected directly to your emotional processing centers by neural pathways that bypass conscious control. This is why, even when you desperately want to hide what you're feeling, your face gives you away. In fractions of a second that most people never notice, these involuntary facial movements are called micro-expressions, and they are the most powerful tool in the behavior reader's arsenal. What micro-expressions actually are: a micro-expression is a full emotional expression that fires across the face in 1/25th to 1/5 of a second. It happens when the limbic system, your emotional brain, activates a genuine expression, and the prefrontal cortex, your conscious, controlling brain, tries to suppress it. The result is a flash. The true expression appears before it can be masked, replaced almost instantly by whatever neutral or socially appropriate expression the person is trying to project. In everyday conversation, these flashes are nearly invisible. But once you know what to look for and you've trained your eyes to catch them, they become unmistakable and deeply revealing. Paul Ekman, the psychologist whose research laid the groundwork for modern micro-expression science, identified 7 universal emotional expressions: anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, surprise, and contempt. These 7 expressions appear across every human culture ever studied. They are hardwired, not learned. A child born blind will make the same facial expressions as sighted children, because the expressions don't come from watching others. They come from the brain itself. Let's decode each one. Anger. Anger produces one of the most recognizable facial signatures. The eyebrows drive downward and pull together toward the center, creating deep vertical furrows between them, sometimes called the 11 lines. The upper eyelids tension and mayhood slightly downward, giving the eyes a narrowed, focused quality. The jaw clenches, often visibly tightening the muscles along the cheekbones. The lips press together firmly, sometimes becoming noticeably thinner. In higher intensity anger, the lips may part with the teeth showing, and the nostrils flare briefly. Even when someone is working extremely hard to appear calm, an anger micro-expression will flash across their face before they can stop it. Watch for that split-second brow furrow, the momentary tightening of the jaw. Then notice how quickly the person shifts back to a neutral expression. That flash is the truth. Fear. Fear creates the opposite brow movement from anger. The eyebrows shoot upward and pull together toward the center, creating horizontal wrinkles across the forehead. The upper eyelids lift dramatically, exposing more white above the iris. Simultaneously, the lower eyelids tense upward, creating an expression of wide-eyed alarm. The mouth often drops slightly open, with lips either stretched horizontally or relaxed and parted. In modern social contexts, you're less likely to see full-blown terror than you are to see its milder relatives: anxiety, apprehension, and unease. The muscular signature is the same, just compressed. When someone is anxious about a topic being discussed, you'll catch that brief flash of fear, the widening eyes, the upward brow pull, before they compose themselves. Disgust. Disgust is the expression most people associate with bad smells or spoiled food, but it's equally triggered by moral revulsion, strong disapproval, or contempt for an idea. The signature movement is the upper lip curling upward, often asymmetrically, one side raising more than the other, creating a slight sneer. The nose bridge wrinkles. The cheeks rise and may push the lower eyelids upward slightly. Pay close attention to disgust micro-expressions during conversations about people, ideas, or decisions. When someone micro-expresses disgust in response to your suggestion before saying, "That's interesting," you now know their real reaction. Happiness. Real versus fake. Of all 7 universal expressions, happiness is the one people try to fake most often, and the one that's most reliably exposed as fake when you know what to look for. Genuine happiness, what researchers call a Duchenne smile, named after the 19th century neurologist who first described it, involves 2 muscle groups firing simultaneously. The zygomatic major pulls the corners of the mouth upward and outward, and the orbicularis oculi, the circular muscle surrounding the eye, contracts, pushing the cheeks upward, narrowing the eye aperture and creating those characteristic crow's feet wrinkles at the outer corners of the eyes. The critical detail: the orbicularis oculi cannot be voluntarily activated by most people. You cannot make your eyes smile on command. Either they do because you feel genuine positive emotion, or they don't. A fake smile uses only the mouth muscles. The eyes remain flat, unengaged, unmoving. Once you start watching for this, the cold eyes above the smiling mouth, you'll see it everywhere: in customer service interactions, in obligatory social photographs, in the faces of people who are being professionally pleasant while feeling something entirely different. Real smiles also appear and fade more slowly than fake ones. They build gradually and fade gradually. Fake smiles tend to switch on and off abruptly, like a light. Sadness. Sadness has a very specific brow signature that's almost impossible to fake voluntarily. The inner corners of the eyebrows, not the outer ends, pull upward and toward each other, creating an inverted V shape in the center of the forehead. Most people, when asked to fake sadness, raise both brows uniformly or furrow them downward like anger. The involuntary inner corner raise is extremely difficult to replicate consciously. Other sadness signals include the lower lip pushing upward and quivering slightly, the corners of the mouth pulling downward, and the upper eyelids drooping with a heavy quality. Even when someone insists they're okay, those inner brow corners will betray them. Surprise. True surprise is perhaps the easiest expression to distinguish from its fake counterpart, because genuine surprise is by definition instantaneous and involuntary. The eyes fly open wide, the brows shoot straight up an arch, the jaw drops freely. The entire expression appears in under a quarter second. Fake surprise, the theatrical, "oh, I had no idea" performance, takes longer to assemble, tends to involve more deliberate muscle control, and often lingers too long on the face. Real surprise is explosive and brief. If someone's surprise expression takes more than a second to peak, or if it holds for more than 2 to 3 seconds before shifting into another expression, it's almost certainly manufactured. Contempt. Save this one for last because it's the one that matters most in high-stakes relationships, and yet it's the one most people are least trained to notice. Contempt is the only asymmetrical universal expression. It shows as one corner of the mouth, tightening and drawing slightly upward on one side only, creating a subtle sneer or smirk. Sometimes it's barely perceptible, just a micro-tightening at the right or left corner. But what it signals is specific and serious. The person experiencing contempt feels a sense of superiority over and moral disapproval of the target. In relationship research, contempt is the single most powerful predictor of relationship failure. It's more predictive than anger, criticism, or defensiveness. When contempt appears consistently between two people, the relationship, romantic, professional, or otherwise, is in serious trouble. In negotiations and business contexts, catching a contempt micro-expression tells you that you've lost someone's respect on a fundamental level, a much more urgent problem than simple disagreement. Training your eyes. Micro-expression recognition is a skill, and like all skills, it improves with deliberate practice. Start by watching videos with the sound off, political interviews, talk show appearances, documentary footage. Focus exclusively on facial expressions. Pause, rewind. Notice what you catch when you're not processing verbal content simultaneously. Then start watching live conversations at restaurants, in meetings, on public transit. Not intrusively, but with the focused attention of someone practicing a craft. Train your eyes to catch the flash before the composed expression settles in. Within weeks of consistent practice, you'll start seeing things you never noticed before. The expression that crosses someone's face when you mention a name they claim not to know. The half second of grief that passes before someone says they're doing great. The flash of contempt before the warm handshake. The face, once you know how to read it, tells everything. The body's silent language, clusters, posture, and what your feet are confessing. If the face is the most expressive part of the body, it's also the most monitored. People spend enormous conscious effort managing their facial expressions, which is why the rest of the body, largely ignored in its own signal sending, is often even more revealing. Body language operates below the threshold of most people's conscious awareness. We manage our faces. We almost never manage our feet. The golden rule: always read clusters. Before we dive into specific signals, lock this rule into your mind permanently. No single body language signal means anything in isolation. A single crossed arm could mean defensiveness, could mean cold, could mean comfort, could mean a muscle cramp. A single averted gaze could mean deception, could mean cultural respect, could mean distraction, could mean cognitive processing. Attempting to interpret individual signals leads to endless false positives and damaged relationships built on misread data. What you're hunting for is clusters, groups of 3, 4, or more behavioral signals that all point in the same direction at the same time. When you see someone who crosses their arms and angles their body away from you and shortens their responses and stops making eye contact and becomes physically still, that cluster is coherent. That cluster is telling you something real. One signal is noise. 3 signals are a pattern. 5 signals are a certainty. Confidence versus insecurity. The posture spectrum. Confident people take up space. This is not metaphorical. It's a literal, measurable, cross-cultural behavioral fact. High-confidence individuals expand their physical footprint. They stand with feet shoulder-width or wider apart. They gesture outward away from their body. Their shoulders sit back and low. Their chin is level or slightly elevated, and they occupy their chair with full, relaxed commitment. Research from Harvard psychologist Amy Cuddy and her colleagues found that even the act of adopting expansive postures for 2 minutes produces measurable hormonal changes, decreasing cortisol and increasing testosterone, which suggests the relationship between posture and confidence runs in both directions. How we hold our body shapes how we feel, as much as how we feel shapes how we hold our body. Insecure or threatened people do the opposite. They compress, shoulders round forward and upward, almost as if trying to shield the throat and chest. Arms pull in close to the body or cross protectively across the torso. The head tilts slightly downward. The stance narrows. The chair is used tentatively, with the person often perching on the edge rather than settling back. Movements become smaller and more careful. Watch this compression happen in real time when someone who seemed confident encounters a situation or person that triggers their insecurity. The physical change is often instantaneous and dramatic. Open versus defensive. Reading the barriers. Open body language is communicative. The torso is facing toward the other person. Arms hang loosely or gesture naturally. Palms are occasionally visible. The person leans forward slightly when engaged, and their feet point toward whoever they're addressing. Feet pointing is particularly revealing. We tend to point our feet toward people or things we're interested in or comfortable with, and away from people or situations we want to escape. In a group conversation, you can often identify who likes whom by tracking whose feet are aimed at whom, even when faces and words are saying something very different. Defensive body language creates barriers, both literal and metaphorical. The crossed arm cluster we mentioned is the most obvious, but people also use objects as barriers, clutching a coffee cup in front of their chest, placing a briefcase or purse between themselves and others, turning a laptop screen to create a visual wall. These object barriers often occur without any conscious awareness. The person reaching for their coffee is rarely thinking, "I'll use this mug as a shield." They're just uncomfortable, and the behavior follows the feeling. The truth about crossed arms. Because this signal is so frequently misread, let's address it directly. Crossed arms means someone is uncomfortable, not necessarily that they're defensive toward you or that they're lying to you. The discomfort could be physical, cold, stomachache, situational, crowded room, bright lights, relational, someone else in the room, or topical, a subject being discussed that has nothing to do with the current moment. Always establish baseline first. Some people cross their arms habitually as a comfort gesture with no negative connotation whatsoever. What matters is change. If someone's arms were open 5 minutes ago and are now crossed, ask yourself what changed in the environment, conversation, or relational dynamics that might account for the shift. Aggression signals. Reading escalation before it happens. Aggressive body language follows a recognizable escalation sequence. Early signals include a slight forward lean into personal space, an expansion of the chest and shoulder width, hands moving to the hips in a blocking stance, the jaw setting firmly, and eye contact becoming harder and more unblinking. As intensity increases, the signals amplify. The body orients squarely toward the perceived threat. Weight shifts forward to the balls of the feet. Fists clench even slightly. The voice drops in pitch and volume while increasing in deliberateness. These are ancient dominance displays, primate in origin, and they read the same way in a corporate meeting as they would on a savanna. Recognizing these early escalation signals allows intervention before conflict erupts. Skilled communicators learn to read the first two levels of the sequence and respond with de-escalating body language, open palms, a slight backward lean, a nod, before the situation reaches the point of no return. Submission and appeasement. On the opposite end of the spectrum, submissive body language makes the person physically smaller and less threatening. The shoulders curl inward and forward. The head tilts to one side, exposing the neck in a gesture of vulnerability that's ancient in its biological significance. Direct eye contact is avoided or broken frequently. The voice becomes quieter and higher. Laughter appears more readily, even in non-humorous moments, as a social appeasement signal. In most Western professional contexts, submission signals read as insecurity or low status. But remember cultural context. These same signals can represent profound respect in hierarchical cultures, where deference to authority is communicated bodily, not verbally. The attraction blueprint. When someone is attracted to another person, their body broadcasts it loudly, to everyone except, often, the person they're attracted to. The most reliable attraction signal is full-body orientation. Attracted people unconsciously rotate their entire body, shoulders, torso, hips, and feet, toward the person of interest, even when they're ostensibly engaged in conversation with someone else. The feet point the emotional truth when the face is being socially careful. Other reliable attraction signals include mirroring, unconsciously adopting the other person's posture, timing their movements and expressions to synchronize. When two people are genuinely connecting, their bodies begin to move like a choreographed conversation, each subtly matching the other's physical language. Proximity reduction, finding reasons to close the physical gap between themselves and the person of interest. An accidental step closer when laughing, leaning in slightly beyond what the noise level requires. Preening behaviors, adjusting clothing, smoothing hair, straightening posture. These grooming displays are entirely unconscious and appear across virtually all mammalian species. Both men and women engage in them. The specific gestures differ, but the function is identical. Increased eye contact, holding gaze slightly longer than social norms require, paired with a softer, more engaged facial expression. Deception in the body. The body language of deception is more complex than most people assume. Because deception triggers cognitive load, lying requires mental effort, which in turn triggers stress responses. The result is a cluster of behavioral changes that don't necessarily look like the dramatic tells popularized in poker books and television crime dramas. Real deception signals tend to include increased self-soothing behaviors, touching the face, neck, or mouth, rubbing hands together, playing with objects. These behaviors soothe the nervous system under stress and increase dramatically when people are managing the cognitive and emotional load of deception. Rigidity. Counterintuitively, many practiced deceivers become more still when lying because they're trying to suppress the natural gestural flow that might betray them. Natural conversation involves fluid, spontaneous gesture. Artificially controlled conversation often looks slightly robotic, pacifying behaviors below the waist, foot tapping, leg bouncing, weight shifting. Because people trying to manage their body language tend to focus on their upper body. The legs and feet often reveal the anxiety their hands are hiding. Micro freezes, brief moments where all movement stops simultaneously, followed by a return to somewhat forced natural movement. These freezes often happen at exactly the point where the lie is being delivered. Again, establish baseline first. Someone who's naturally still and controlled looks identical to a deceiver who's suppressing movement. The change from their baseline is the signal, not the absolute behavior itself. Spatial dynamics. Who owns the room? The way people navigate shared physical space reveals their status, confidence, and relationship dynamics with remarkable clarity. High-status individuals claim territory. They arrive and immediately expand, setting down belongings that mark their space, positioning themselves where they can see the most of the room, taking seats that offer visual control of the environment. They move through shared spaces without asking permission, adjusting the environment, moving chairs, opening windows, changing the thermostat, as though it's their right. They're comfortable being observed. Lower status individuals are more tentative in their spatial behavior. They position themselves in peripheral spots, take up minimal space, and tend to wait for social permission before acting on the environment. In group settings, watch who moves toward whom when entering a room. The direction of movement reflects the direction of status. Lower status people approach. Higher status people receive. The next time you're in a meeting, watch the room dynamics before anyone speaks. The physical choreography. Who sits where? Who moves freely? Whose objects claim the most territory? Will tell you the informal hierarchy of the group more accurately than any org chart. The voice that can't lie. Decoding. Vocal patterns, rhythm, and the hidden music of speech. Here's a test you can run right now. Think of someone in your life who recently told you everything was fine when you instinctively knew something was wrong. What tipped you off? Chances are, it wasn't their words, and if you're honest with yourself, it might not even have been their expression or their posture. It was the way they sounded. The human voice is one of the richest and most overlooked channels of psychological information available to us. While people carefully select their words and work to manage their expressions, vocal patterns are produced by dozens of involuntary, physiological processes that change automatically with emotional state. The result? The voice tells truths the mouth is trying to conceal. The emotional acoustics. Every major emotional state produces a distinctive vocal signature. Once you can identify these signatures, conversations become layered with information you never had access to before. Fear and anxiety raise vocal pitch as tension constricts the vocal cords. Speech rate often increases as stress hormones accelerate cognitive processing. The voice may develop a slight breathiness or tremor, and articulation sometimes becomes imprecise, words running together or ending imprecisely. In moderate anxiety, you'll also hear an increase in the frequency of throat clearing and swallowing sounds, both involuntary responses to the physiological changes anxiety produces. Anger typically deepens the voice and increases its volume as the person projects dominance. Speech becomes clipped, consonants sharper, sentences ending more abruptly. In intense anger, words sometimes run together as the person races to externalize their internal pressure. Sadness and depression produce the opposite of anger. The voice loses energy, drops in pitch, and slows dramatically. There's often a flat, monotonous quality, reduced variation in pitch and rhythm that reflects the emotional flatness of the state. Sentences may trail off without fully completing. Genuine excitement produces bright, animated vocal patterns with wide pitch variation, increased speech rate, and clear articulation. Unlike anxious speed, excited speech maintains precision. The person is thinking faster than usual and enunciating each word clearly because they want to be understood. Confidence versus insecurity in the voice. Vocal confidence has several reliable signatures. Confident speakers use the lower portion of their vocal range, not artificially deep, but grounded. They speak at a measured pace that doesn't rush to fill silence. They articulate clearly and complete their sentences. And crucially, they are comfortable with pauses. They use silence the way great musicians use rests, as a structural element of communication, not as a void to be panicked by. Insecure vocal patterns are almost the exact mirror image. The voice rises toward the upper register. Speech accelerates, often because the person is subconsciously afraid of being interrupted or of having the floor taken before they've said what they need to say. Sentences sometimes terminate upward in pitch, even when they're statements, a pattern known as uptalk or high-rising terminal, effectively turning declarations into requests for validation. I went to Harvard, and I majored in economics. The use of excessive filler words, like, you know, sort of, also signals low confidence in the communication, even when the underlying idea is strong. Hedging language is particularly revealing. Qualifiers like, I think maybe, I'm not totally sure, but, and this might be wrong, but preemptively apologize for statements before they're even made. In someone speaking about a domain in which they're genuinely expert, sudden hedging is a signal that something has shifted, either the topic or the emotional state. The vocal signatures of deception. This is where vocal analysis becomes genuinely powerful and genuinely tricky, because deception manifests differently across individuals depending on their baseline. Some people speak slower when lying, because the cognitive load of constructing a false narrative requires more processing time. They pause in unusual places, not at the end of thoughts where natural pauses fall, but within sentences before delivering key pieces of information. Others speak faster, trying to push through the deception quickly before their body can betray them. The critical variable is baseline. Neither faster nor slower speech is inherently suspicious. Change from someone's established speaking pace is what matters. Several vocal patterns do appear with reasonable consistency across deceivers, however. Reduced use of contractions. Liars often shift from natural contracted speech. I didn't, I couldn't, I wasn't, to formal emphatic full forms. I did not, I could not, I was not. This pattern appears to reflect the liar's subconscious attempt to sound more emphatic and credible, or to create a subtle psychological distance from the statement. Distancing language, referring to people, places, or objects with formal or vague labels rather than the natural, possessive terms one would use when genuinely connected to them. The car instead of my car. A woman I know instead of the person's name. That situation instead of what happened. Unusual pauses, appearing before key emotional or evidentiary details rather than after them. In truthful narrative, pauses typically fall at the end of significant disclosures. The person delivers the information, then pauses to let it land. In constructed narratives, pauses sometimes appear before key information, as the person rapidly assembles the next piece of the story. Vocal flatness on details that should carry emotion. When describing a genuinely distressing or exciting experience, honest people typically show appropriate emotional coloring in their voice. When recounting an experience they didn't actually have, the emotional resonance is often missing or slightly misaligned. The words are correct, but the acoustic signature doesn't match the story. Laughter as data laughter is one of the most underanalyzed vocal signals and one of the most informative. Genuine laughter has a specific acoustic profile. It tends to explode from the beginning, building to peak energy within the first syllable or two, then trailing off in decreasing bursts. It's slightly unpredictable in rhythm. It involves the entire respiratory system. Genuine laughter is physically demanding. Polite laughter, the social signal we emit to communicate appreciation, inclusion, or rapport, is more controlled. It starts more deliberately, maintains more consistent rhythm, and often ends more abruptly. It doesn't involve the whole body. Nervous laughter is higher in pitch than social laughter and tends to appear in contextually inappropriate moments, during serious topics, after questions that create social anxiety, or in response to statements that weren't humorous but might have been threatening. Contemptuous laughter, a brief, sharp exhale through the nose, sometimes barely audible, is one of the most potent signals of dismissal and superiority. Pay close attention the next time you make a suggestion and someone responds with a short nasal exhale before moving on. Rhythm, pacing, and the mirroring effect. When two people are genuinely connecting, when conversation is flowing and both parties are engaged and comfortable, something interesting happens to their vocal patterns. They begin to synchronize. Their speaking rates drift toward each other. Their pause lengths start to match. Their vocal energy levels align. In some interactions, their breathing rhythms even synchronize. This is called vocal mirroring, and it's an unconscious process driven by the same neural mechanisms behind physical mirroring. Mirror neurons that cause us to simulate the states of people we're engaged with. When vocal mirroring is present, the conversation has a musical quality, a sense of flow and rhythm that both parties usually experience as ease or chemistry. When it breaks down, when the rhythms fall out of sync, when one person's energy rises while the other's drops, when response timing becomes unpredictable, it's a signal that connection is being lost. Track these shifts in important conversations and you'll know exactly when you've said something that landed wrong before the other person has decided how to respond to it. Baselines, deviations, and the art of reading between the lines. By now, you've absorbed a powerful toolkit. Micro-expressions, body language clusters, vocal patterns, and the foundational principles of behavioral reading. But there's a meta-skill that underlies all of it, one that separates the amateur observer from the genuinely expert behavioral analyst. That skill is baseline calibration. Without an accurate baseline, all of your behavioral observations are floating in space. A nervous gesture might be this person's normal. A confident posture might be an unusual effort. Rapid speech might be how this individual always talks. Without a reference point, a map of who this person is when they're neutral and comfortable, you have no way to know what's signal and what's noise. What baseline really means. A behavioral baseline is a comprehensive picture of how a specific individual presents when they're at ease, not emotionally activated, and not under unusual pressure. It includes their resting posture and gesture patterns, their typical speech rate and volume, their natural eye contact norms, their default facial expression at rest, their standard breathing rhythm, and their typical emotional expressiveness. Crucially, baselines are individual. They are not cultural averages or demographic norms. Some people are naturally animated communicators. Others are naturally contained. Some people maintain intense eye contact naturally. Others naturally look away when thinking. Some people are fast talkers. Others are deliberate and slow. None of these traits are better or worse, more honest or more suspicious. They're simply that person's baseline. Your job in any meaningful interaction is to establish that person's baseline as quickly as possible, then watch it like a hawk for deviations. How to build a baseline efficiently. The fastest way to establish a behavioral baseline is to engage the person in comfortable, low-stakes conversation about neutral topics and observe them for 10 to 15 minutes. Ask about something genuinely non-threatening, their hometown, a recent trip, something they've enjoyed lately, the weekend's plans. Keep the conversation light and easy. Your goal is not to gather information. It's to observe the person's natural behavioral patterns while they're relaxed and not under scrutiny. Professional interrogators call this the rapport phase. And even when their ultimate goal is to detect deception, they spend significant time in this phase, not because it builds relationship, though it does, but because it gives them a precise behavioral map they'll use later. During baseline establishment, note speech cadence. How fast do they talk? How long are their sentences? Do they use filler words naturally? How long do they pause between thoughts? Gestural patterns. How much do they move their hands? Close to the body or extended outward? Frequent or rare gestures? Eye contact rhythm. How much do they naturally hold gaze? Do they look away when thinking? Where do they tend to look when processing? Postural defaults. How do they sit or stand? Upright or relaxed? Forward or back? Open or closed? Emotional range. How expressive are they naturally? Quick to laugh. Serious and measured. This map becomes your reference. Now, when you shift the conversation to more significant topics, you'll know immediately when the behavioral landscape changes. Reading the deviation clusters. Deviations are most meaningful when they occur in clusters, multiple behavioral shifts happening simultaneously at a particular moment in the conversation. Imagine someone who's been talking fluidly and openly for 15 minutes, gesturing freely, maintaining relaxed eye contact, sitting back in their chair with open posture, speaking at a moderate pace with their natural energy. Then you ask about something specific, a decision they made, an event they were involved in, a person they know, and in the span of 3 seconds you observe. Their gesturing stops almost entirely. Their posture tightens and their body angled slightly away. Their eye contact breaks and their gaze drifts downward. Their speech rate slows and they insert an uncharacteristic pause before answering. Their voice rises a half tone in pitch. That's 5 simultaneous deviations from a clearly established baseline, all triggered by a single topic. The cluster is loud and coherent. Something meaningful is happening internally. It doesn't necessarily mean deception. It might mean guilt, embarrassment, old emotional pain, anxiety about your reaction, or something else entirely. But it tells you clearly that this topic carries significant emotional weight for this person. And that's valuable information regardless of the specific reason. The question of why versus the question of what. Here's an important distinction that many aspiring behavior readers miss. Your job, in most contexts, is to identify what is happening internally, not to immediately diagnose why. You observe, this person shows significant behavioral deviation when topic X comes up. You do not immediately conclude, therefore this person is lying about topic X. The deviation tells you there's an internal response. The nature of that response, whether it's deception, anxiety, shame, grief, attraction, or something else, requires more information, more context, more observation. Jumping from deviation detected to explanation confirmed is one of the most common and damaging errors in behavioral analysis. Use deviations as questions, not answers. When you see a cluster, your internal dialogue should be, something is happening here. What could that be? How do I find out more? Not, I know what this means. The time-shifting problem. One common complication in baseline reading is time-based variation. People's behavioral baselines aren't fixed across the entire day. They shift with energy levels, mood, and biological rhythms. Most people have a natural energy peak in the late morning, experience a physiological dip in mid-afternoon, and have varied evening patterns depending on their individual chronotype. Someone who's naturally animated and expressive at 10 a.m. might appear contained and subdued at 3 p.m. Not because anything meaningful has changed emotionally, but because their biological clock says nap. These natural rhythmic variations can create false positives if you don't account for them. Whenever possible, note the time of day when you're establishing baseline and be cautious about comparisons made across very different time periods. Environmental factors that shift baseline. Physical environments affect behavior independent of psychology. Cold temperatures compress posture and arms regardless of emotional state. Loud environments produce more dramatic gesturing, more leaning in, and more intense eye contact, none of which reflects interpersonal dynamics, just acoustic compensation. High-stress environments like hospitals, courtrooms, or crisis management rooms elevate everyone's physiological arousal, producing anxiety signals in people who aren't anxious about anything in particular. Before interpreting any behavioral cluster as meaningful, run it through the environmental filter. Could something about this physical context explain what I'm seeing, independent of this person's internal state? Cross-context. Observation, the deepest insight. The most powerful baseline information comes from observing the same person across radically different contexts. Watch how your confident colleague behaves in their boss's office versus at the company picnic. Notice how your typically warm friend interacts with servers versus with people they perceive as high status. Observe the difference in someone's behavior when they're discussing their professional expertise versus a topic they know nothing about. These cross-context comparisons reveal something no single observation can: the difference between situational behavior and character-level behavior patterns. Situational behavior tells you about the current context. Character-level patterns, visible only across multiple contexts, tell you who this person actually is. Context, culture, and the environmental lens. Why the same signal means everything and nothing. You've now built a substantial toolkit for reading people. But before you deploy it, there's a critical error that trips up even experienced behavior readers. One that causes not just analytical mistakes, but genuine harm to relationships and cross-cultural dynamics. That error is context blindness, interpreting behavioral signals as though they exist in a neutral, cultureless, context-free vacuum. They don't. And applying the same interpretation to the same signal, regardless of context, will make you wrong as often as you're right. Physical environment is behavioral architecture. The spaces we inhabit don't just contain behavior, they shape it. Human beings are exquisitely responsive to environmental conditions in ways that produce predictable behavioral patterns entirely independent of internal psychological states. Temperature is among the most common source of false positives in body language reading. People in cold environments naturally cross their arms, hunch their shoulders, keep movements compact, and speak slightly faster. Exactly the behaviors associated with defensiveness and anxiety. Before interpreting a cluster of closed behaviors, ask, is it cold in here? Lighting substantially affects behavioral patterns. Bright, high-contrast lighting makes people more alert, more precise in their movements, and more formal in their posture. Dim lighting produces the opposite: more relaxed, more intimate behaviors. Neither tells you anything about what the person thinks of you or their honesty level. Crowding triggers a cascade of defensive-looking behaviors that have nothing to do with defensiveness. Reduced eye contact to minimize unwanted contact with strangers. Physically compact posture to take up less shared space. Faster movement through space and more guarded facial expressions. A subway car full of people all avoiding eye contact isn't full of people with things to hide. They're just adapting to the social pressures of crowded public space. Social hierarchies shape behavior. One of the most profound contextual factors affecting behavior is the social hierarchy of the immediate environment. People do not behave the same way across all social contexts. They modulate their behavior constantly in response to the perceived status of those around them. The same individual may present as confident and expansive in their home environment, measured and formal in their workplace, and slightly deferential in the presence of someone they perceive as significantly higher status. None of these represent the real them in some pure sense. They all represent authentic adaptations to different social environments. This is especially important in professional settings. Someone who seems withdrawn and submissive in a meeting with senior executives might be running those same people's department with extraordinary confidence. Read behavior in the context of the specific social hierarchy it's occurring within. Cultural contexts, where many good readers go wrong. Of all the contextual variables affecting behavioral interpretation, culture is simultaneously the most important and the most frequently ignored. Eye contact is perhaps the clearest example of cross-cultural behavioral variation. In most mainstream American contexts, direct, sustained eye contact signals confidence, honesty, and respect. Teaching children to look people in the eye is a standard parenting practice. American corporate culture tends to view averted gaze as suspicious or untrustworthy. In many East Asian cultures, sustained direct eye contact, particularly with someone of higher status, can be perceived as aggressive, challenging, or disrespectful. Children in some cultures are explicitly taught not to make prolonged eye contact with adults as a demonstration of respect. Interpreting this averted gaze through an American cultural lens and concluding, "This person has something to hide," would be a serious analytical error. Personal space norms vary by roughly 2 to 3 feet across cultural groups. Northern European and North American cultures typically prefer a larger, intimate bubble, roughly 18 inches to 2 feet for casual acquaintances. Mediterranean, Latin American, and many Middle Eastern cultures conduct normal casual conversation at a much smaller distance. Someone standing 18 inches from you might feel invasive in an American professional context. The same proximity in a Lebanese cultural context simply means they're paying attention and finding you interesting. Touch norms create significant cross-cultural variation in what normal interaction looks like. In some Southern European and Latin American cultures, casual touch during conversation, on the arm, on the shoulder, briefly on the knee, is entirely normal and means nothing more than engagement and warmth. In more touch-cautious cultures like mainstream American professional contexts or many Northern European settings, the same touch would signal a very specific level of intimacy, or, depending on context, unwelcome contact. Applying your cultural touch norms to someone from a different background can lead you to read normal friendliness as inappropriate intent or reserved comfort with touch as emotional coldness. Emotional expressiveness varies enormously by culture, family background, regional origin, and generation. Americans, broadly speaking, tend toward emotional expressiveness as a social norm, smiling frequently, using enthusiastic greetings, showing visible reactions to what they hear. Many Northern European cultures find this level of expressiveness insincere or performative, and default to more measured, contained emotional display as their norm. When an American encounters someone with more contained emotional expressiveness and concludes they seem cold or they seem guarded, they're often simply encountering a different emotional display norm, not a different emotional reality. Time of day, week, and year. As context, human behavior is deeply rhythmic. Behavior that makes perfect sense at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday tells you something very different from the same behavior at 7 p.m. on a Friday. Energy levels, emotional availability, social appetite, cognitive sharpness. All of these fluctuate with circadian rhythms, weekly cycles, and even seasonal patterns for some people. Professional behavioralists who conduct high-stakes assessments, interviews, negotiations, depositions, often prefer morning sessions not just because they prefer mornings themselves, but because baseline behavior is typically more stable, energy is more predictable, and deviations are more clearly readable earlier in the day before the accumulated fatigue of the day begins to blur the signal. Be cautious about conclusions drawn from single observations that might simply reflect time of day variation rather than meaningful psychological signals. Technology as context, the new behavioral frontier. The digital revolution has created entirely new behavioral contexts that require new interpretive frameworks. Understanding digital behavior patterns gives you insight into people's personalities, emotional states, and priorities through channels that simply didn't exist a generation ago. Response time to texts and emails is one of the most revealing modern behavioral signals, and one of the most complex to interpret. Rapid responses can indicate eagerness, anxiety, boredom, or simply a lifestyle where phones are constantly at hand. Delayed responses can indicate busyness, calculated strategy, genuine immersion in other activities, or a deliberate message about priority. The most informative signal is change from pattern. Someone who typically responds to your messages within minutes, suddenly taking hours is telling you something, though what exactly requires additional context to interpret. Message length, punctuation choices, emoji usage, and the specific word selection in digital communication all carry behavioral information that mirrors, in modified form, the same principles governing face-to-face interaction. Formal language in an informal channel often signals stress, conflict avoidance, or deliberate distance. Unusual precision from someone who typically communicates casually may signal that they know their words could be read by someone other than you. Video call behavior has become increasingly important as remote communication has expanded. Because people know they're being observed on video, they tend to manage their upper body more consciously, producing slightly more controlled and formal behavior than they display in person. But the same micro-expressions, the same vocal patterns, the same momentary inconsistencies all occur on screen as in person. The frame may be smaller, but the signals are the same. Advanced pattern recognition, from reading people to predicting them. Once you've built solid foundational skills in facial reading, body language interpretation, vocal analysis, and baseline calibration, something remarkable begins to happen. You stop just reading what's happening now, and you start seeing what's going to happen next. This is advanced pattern recognition, the ability to identify behavioral sequences that reliably predict future actions, responses, and emotional states. Personality patterns, the consistent templates. Every person has a behavioral fingerprint, a characteristic set of patterns that recur consistently across contexts and time. Once you can identify these patterns, interactions become predictable in a way that dramatically increases your effectiveness in every relationship. Extroverted behavioral templates are characterized by expansive physical presence, high verbal output, quick responsiveness, comfort with social attention, and behavioral energy that tends to increase with more people in the environment. Extroverts process their thinking aloud. You can watch the ideas forming as they speak, rather than receiving already formed conclusions. Introverted behavioral templates are characterized by more contained physical presence, more deliberate verbal contribution, preference for focused one-on-one engagement over group dynamics, and energy patterns that reflect depletion rather than recharge from extended social interaction. Introverts typically process internally before speaking. The pause before they respond often contains the most important thinking. Detail-oriented personalities reveal themselves through precise language choices, discomfort with ambiguity, careful attention to consistency. They'll notice if you contradict yourself from earlier in the conversation, and a systematic approach to conversation that tends to proceed from specifics to conclusions, rather than vice versa. Big-picture personalities display the opposite. They speak in themes and frameworks, tolerate ambiguity comfortably, sometimes skip over obvious details because they're already 3 conceptual steps ahead, and can be visibly impatient with excessive granularity. Competitive personalities constantly, often unconsciously, reference their own performance, status, and achievements in conversation. Their body language claims space and projects dominance. They make quick decisions without extensive consultation, because consultation implies uncertainty. They show subtle discomfort when others are receiving attention they feel they deserve. Collaborative personalities default to inclusive language. We, rather than I, actively invite others' input before concluding, display open and welcoming body language, and show discomfort with winner-take-all dynamics. Emotional escalation sequences. Anger rarely arrives without warning. It builds through a predictable sequence. Mild irritation to increasing frustration, to visible agitation to escalation risk. Each stage has its behavioral signature. Mild irritation shows in subtle facial tension, slightly shortened responses, and a fractional decrease in eye contact. Frustration adds vocal edge, more compressed body language, and reduced engagement with your words. Visible agitation produces the full anger cluster. Jaw setting, forward lean, volume increase, sharper consonants. Escalation risk is characterized by the complete behavioral package of aggression signals described in Chapter 3. The value of reading this sequence is that it gives you multiple intervention points before you reach the explosive stage. Every stage before the final one is a point where a skilled communicator can adjust, soften the approach, acknowledge the other person's perspective, create physical space, slow the pacing, and redirect the trajectory. Similarly, stress builds through stages that give skilled observers advance warning before someone reaches their breaking point. Early stress signals include increased fidgeting, changes in breathing, rate, shortened responses, and more frequent self-soothing behaviors. Intermediate stress signals include more pronounced behavioral changes in all these channels, plus vocal shifts and decreased cognitive flexibility. Late-stage stress produces behavioral patterns that can easily be misread as aggression, withdrawal, or irrationality, because at that point, the person's prefrontal cortex is being overwhelmed by the limbic system's stress response. Catching the early and intermediate stages and responding appropriately prevents the late-stage crisis. Deception sequences. Deception isn't a single behavior. It's a sequence that typically unfolds in 3 phases. The pre-deception phase occurs as the person recognizes they're approaching the territory where a lie will be required. You'll often see a brief pause, increased self-soothing, a micro shift in posture, and sometimes an almost imperceptible intake of breath. Some people buy themselves processing time by repeating your question before answering it. Do I know where the files are? Let me think about that. The deception phase itself typically involves the signals discussed in earlier chapters: vocal changes, increased rigidity, or decreased natural gesture, distancing language, unusual pause placement, and the misalignment between emotional content and vocal coloring. The post-deception phase is often the most telling. Many people experience a brief but visible behavioral release once the lie has been delivered and they've moved past it. A slight postural relaxation, a micro exhale, occasionally an almost imperceptible smile of relief. They've gotten through it. Watch for this behavioral exhale. It often occurs right as conversation moves to the next topic, and its timing is precisely what makes it meaningful. Trust and relationship. Trajectory trust builds and erodes through behavioral sequences that skilled observers can track in real time. Early in a new relationship, protective body language is normal and expected. Formal posture, measured disclosure, testing behaviors, small self-revelations offered to see how they're received before bigger ones follow. As trust begins to build, these protective patterns relax. Posture opens, personal space decreases, disclosure deepens, mirroring increases, and the behavioral signature of the interaction becomes progressively warmer. When trust is being damaged or lost, the reverse sequence appears. Previously open body language begins to close. Disclosure becomes more cautious and surface level. Mirroring decreases. Response timing lengthens. The vocabulary becomes more formal. Physical distance increases. Tracking these sequences tells you the real-time health of any relationship, regardless of what's being said verbally. Manipulation pattern recognition. Skilled manipulators follow a recognizable behavioral sequence that, once you can identify it, becomes very difficult to fall victim to. The sequence typically begins with charm, often disproportionate to the situation or to the depth of the relationship. Excessive warmth, flattery, mirroring, and agreement in early interactions are not necessarily positive signals. They may be the opening move of a manipulation sequence. This is followed by testing behavior, small requests or minor boundary violations introduced with plausible deniability. If those tests pass, if you comply or ignore the violation, the requests escalate. At each stage, the manipulator watches for resistance and, when met with it, deploys specific tools. Guilt, after everything I've done. Obligation, I thought we were friends. Or manufactured scarcity and urgency. This is your only chance. Recognizing this sequence early, specifically identifying the testing phase before you've already complied with several escalating requests, is the single most effective protection against manipulation. The sequence is consistent enough across different manipulators and contexts that once you've seen it clearly, you'll recognize its early stages immediately. Ethics, applications, and the path to mastery. You now possess one of the most powerful skill sets a human being can develop, the ability to see beneath the surface of social interaction and understand what people are actually experiencing, intending, and concealing. This power comes with a direct ethical responsibility that cannot be separated from the skill itself. How you use this knowledge will determine whether you become someone who builds extraordinary relationships and improves every room you enter, or someone who exploits vulnerabilities and leaves damaged trust in their wake. The fundamental ethical principle: reading people accurately is morally neutral. What you do with that reading is where ethics live. The highest application of behavioral insight is using it to communicate better and serve others more effectively. When you notice that someone is uncomfortable with the direction of a conversation, the ethical move is to adjust, to create safety, to change the subject, to acknowledge what you're sensing. When you detect that someone is under unusual stress, the ethical move is to offer support or ease the interaction, not to press for advantage while they're vulnerable. The manipulative application, using behavioral insight to exploit weaknesses, pressure decisions, engineer compliance, or take advantage of emotional states, is a violation of the fundamental trust that underlies human relationship. Beyond its ethical wrongness, it's also practically self-defeating. People who consistently use their reading abilities to exploit others eventually find themselves surrounded by people who don't trust them, often without understanding why. The understanding versus manipulation distinction. Understanding that someone is emotionally invested in a particular outcome so that you can address their concerns more completely. That's understanding. Understanding that someone is emotionally invested in a particular outcome so you can artificially inflate their anxiety about losing it and pressure them into a rushed decision. That's manipulation. The behavioral signals are identical. The internal intention and the resulting action determine which side of the ethical line you're on. Professional applications. Where these skills pay largest. In job interviews, the ability to read interviewers transforms the interaction from a one-sided performance into a dynamic exchange. Notice when the interviewer leans forward. That's engagement. Follow that thread. Notice when their eye contact breaks or their energy drops. You've lost them. Pivot. Read whether they prefer detailed narratives or concise answers by watching how long their attention holds during your responses. Adapt in real time. As an interviewer, behavioral reading helps you assess genuine competence versus polished performance, authentic enthusiasm versus rehearsed energy, real experience versus credentialed approximation. In negotiations, the ability to read real interest versus performed disinterest, genuine flexibility versus strategic stonewalling, and authentic constraints versus tactical pressure is worth more than any negotiating framework in any textbook. The single most valuable behavioral signal in negotiation: watching what someone does with their body in the moment after you make a proposal. The face they compose deliberately. The body responds immediately. In leadership, behavioral reading is the foundation of emotional intelligence in practice. Knowing when your team is burned out before they say so. Sensing when someone has an idea they're not voicing. Catching the early stage conflict before it explodes. Recognizing when a team member is disengaged and address it before they resign. The leader who can read their team accurately creates entirely different organizational dynamics than the one who only processes what people say explicitly. In sales and customer relations, understanding what a customer actually cares about versus what they're expressing verbally allows you to address real needs rather than stated needs, which dramatically increases both conversion and customer satisfaction. In romantic relationships, behavioral literacy creates a depth of communication that words alone can't achieve. Being able to sense when your partner is struggling before they can articulate it. Adjusting your approach to match their actual emotional state rather than their composed presentation. Noticing when your words are landing differently than you intended. These capabilities transform relationship quality. In parenting, reading children's behavioral signals is especially valuable because children, particularly young ones and adolescents, often lack the vocabulary or emotional clarity to articulate what they're experiencing internally. A child who's being bullied may not know how to tell you, but their behavioral changes will. A teenager who's in over their head in a social situation may perform everything's fine verbally, while every nonverbal channel signals distress. Practicing toward mastery. Mastery in behavioral reading doesn't happen through passive exposure. It requires deliberate, systematic practice with regular feedback loops. Start with single-channel isolation. Spend 1 week observing only facial expressions, ignoring body language and voice entirely. Then shift your focus exclusively to body language for a week, then vocal patterns only. This isolation builds each channel's sensitivity before you integrate them. Public observation practice at airports, coffee shops, public parks provides rich, consequence-free material. Watch two people across a restaurant and try to identify the emotional tenor of their interaction from body language alone. Watch how someone's behavior changes when their phone rings. Notice the behavioral microsequence when a stranger approaches someone to ask directions. Video analysis with the ability to pause and rewind is invaluable. Political speeches, documentary interviews, and reality competition shows all provide material where you can observe behavioral signals in slow motion. Test your readings against contextual information and calibrate your accuracy. Feedback loops are essential to avoid the trap of unverified pattern recognition. Whenever possible, check your behavioral readings against ground truth. Follow-up conversations, external information, outcomes. Note where you were accurate and where you were wrong. The patterns in your errors reveal the specific biases and blind spots you need to correct. Common mistakes that undermine accuracy. The single signal trap. Interpreting isolated gestures rather than clusters. Address it by refusing to conclude anything from fewer than 3 simultaneous signals. Projection bias. Reading your own emotional state into others' behavior. Address it by asking yourself, before any behavioral assessment, what am I feeling right now, and might that be coloring what I'm seeing? Confirmation bias. Finding evidence that supports your existing impression while ignoring contradictory signals. Address it by actively hunting for signals that contradict your initial read before finalizing any assessment. Cultural blindness. Applying your cultural behavioral norms to people from different backgrounds. Address it by explicitly asking what cultural context might explain this. Before concluding anything. The baseline rush. Making assessments before establishing a proper baseline. Address it by committing to at least 10 minutes of neutral observation before making any meaningful interpretive conclusions. Overconfidence. Treating behavioral assessments as certainties rather than probabilistic hypotheses. Address it by maintaining genuine epistemic humility. Even expert behavioral analysts under ideal conditions achieve accuracy rates around 80%. In the complex real world, that number is often lower. Behavior reading is a tool for better questions, not a machine for certain answers. Real-world scenarios. Applying everything you've learned. Theory becomes mastery through application. In this chapter, we walk through the specific scenarios where behavioral reading skills deliver the clearest, most measurable return, and how to deploy your skills with precision in each one. The job interview. Whether you're interviewing or being interviewed, behavioral literacy transforms this high-stakes interaction. As a candidate, your first job is to establish baseline rapport with your interviewer before the real interview begins. The first few minutes of small talk aren't wasted time. They're your behavioral baseline building window. Note how the interviewer speaks, how much eye contact they maintain, whether they gesture freely or remain contained, whether they seem to prefer brevity or detail in responses. This baseline tells you how to modulate your communication style throughout the interview. Watch for engagement signals as you answer questions. Forward lean, increased eye contact, open posture, and follow-up questions that go deeper on something you mentioned. These tell you where genuine interest lies. Follow those threads. Watch for disengagement signals. Postural shift back, eye contact reduction, note-taking that seems to be fulfilling a process rather than capturing something important. Questions that seem to follow a scripted sequence without adaptation to your answers. These tell you that you've either lost them or haven't yet connected on what they actually care about. Pivot. As an interviewer, the baseline you establish in the comfortable opening phase becomes your reference for reading the candidate throughout more challenging questions. When did their energy and openness change? At what specific question? What does that tell you about where their story may be less solid? Authentic enthusiasm about a role looks different from desperate need. Genuine expertise produces a particular behavioral ease when discussing it. Natural gesture, comfortable pacing, willingness to go deep and admit uncertainty at the edges. Performed expertise tends to be slightly too smooth and too comprehensive, without the natural, well, that depends qualifications that real deep knowledge produces. Negotiations. In any negotiation, the most valuable behavioral information comes in the moments immediately after you've made a proposal, before the other person has had time to compose their response. Watch their face in the half-second after you name a number, make a demand, or propose a term. The micro-expression that flashes before the composed response is the truth. Surprise, the full, rapid expression, means your number genuinely caught them off guard, in either direction. Contempt means they find your position unreasonable. A suppressed smile means you left money on the table. Micro-anger means you've touched a point they feel strongly about. Genuine interest in your proposal produces specific body language, a slight forward lean, increased visual focus, a tendency to go quieter and more internal while processing. This is the considering cluster, and it's often misread as coldness or rejection. Performed disinterest, the classic poker face, is revealed by the stillness required to maintain it. Natural neutrality isn't perfectly still. Perfect stillness, paradoxically, signals effort. When someone is genuinely at their limit, when "I can't go any lower" is actually true rather than strategic, their behavioral cluster is usually reduced eye contact, a slight postural retreat, reduced gesture, and a vocal softness that reflects genuine helplessness rather than strategic positioning. Strategic, "I'm at my limit" performances tend to involve maintained eye contact, more deliberate vocal emphasis, and a forward rather than backward postural lean. Detecting deception in high-stakes conversations. When truth matters and you suspect you may not be getting it, behavioral literacy becomes your most reliable tool. Imperfect, but far better than relying on words alone. First, establish a solid baseline. If you jump straight to the sensitive territory, you have no reference point. Second, ask open-ended questions that require narrative rather than yes/no answers. Walk me through what happened that day. Tell me about your relationship with X. Deception in narrative produces specific patterns, stories that are either too short, minimal content to defend, or too long, or excessive detail as a compensation strategy. Unusual sequencing, events told out of order, and a tendency to avoid specific sensory detail, which genuine memories contain naturally. Third, watch for the behavioral shifts that accompany specific points in the narrative. The deviation cluster is typically strongest at the exact sentence, sometimes the exact word, where the deception lies. Fourth, maintain appropriate uncertainty. Behavioral signals indicate possible deception. They rarely constitute proof. Use your reading as a guide for what to probe further, not as a basis for accusation. Navigating group dynamics, reading individual people is complex. Reading groups is a different skill, one that focuses less on individual signals and more on the behavioral choreography between people. When you enter a group setting, first observe the spatial hierarchy. Who positions themselves centrally? Who gravitates to the periphery? Who other people physically orient toward when a decision seems imminent? These positioning patterns reflect the informal power structure of the group, which often diverges significantly from the formal hierarchy. Track behavioral synchronization. High cohesion groups that trust each other and share a common direction show synchronized energy, matched pacing, and natural mirroring. Low cohesion groups or groups experiencing underlying conflict show behavioral asynchrony, mismatched energy, talking over patterns, inconsistent eye contact circuits, and body language that angles away from the center of the group. Notice whose ideas produce behavioral engagement in others, who leans in, who starts nodding, whose pen starts moving when a particular person speaks. And notice whose ideas produce the opposite, a collective slight withdrawal, increased phone checking, a subtle group retreat into more closed postures. Formal titles notwithstanding, the person who produces the former behavioral response is the group's actual influencer. Crisis and conflict situations. When a situation is deteriorating, when tension is escalating toward conflict, behavioral reading provides both an early warning system and a real-time guide to de-escalation. The escalation sequence we described in Chapter 7 is your early warning system. When you catch someone at the irritation or frustration stage, de-escalation is relatively simple. Acknowledge their perspective, reduce the pace and intensity of your own communication, create physical space, and demonstrate genuine interest in understanding their position. At the visible agitation stage, de-escalation requires more active intervention. Explicit acknowledgement. I can see this is really frustrating. Vocal and postural signals of openness and non-threat, open palms, relaxed shoulders, slightly increased distance, and a complete pause on whatever content was driving the escalation. At the late stage, when full anger or aggressive posturing has appeared, attempting rational discussion is usually futile. The prefrontal cortex is offline. The behavioral priority becomes creating safety, space, and time for the person's regulatory system to recover before any substantive conversation resumes. Building mastery for life. The continuous journey of understanding people. The skills in this book aren't a destination. They're a practice, an ongoing discipline of observation, calibration, feedback, and growth that deepens over an entire lifetime of human interaction. Here's what a lifetime of this practice actually builds. The compounding effect. Every person you read accurately contributes to your overall skill in ways that compound. Every micro-expression you catch adds to your pattern library. Every baseline you establish and then observe in deviation makes your next baseline calibration faster and more precise. Every cultural context you've navigated expands your interpretive flexibility. The person who has been practicing behavioral observation deliberately for 5 years doesn't just have 5 times the skill of a first-year practitioner. They have something qualitatively different. The patterns have become intuitive. The processing has moved below the level of conscious analysis into the fluid, rapid recognition that characterizes true expertise. This is the level where reading people stops being a set of techniques and becomes a way of experiencing the world. A persistent, rich, automatic awareness of the interior lives being expressed all around you in every interaction. What this skill does to your relationships. When you can accurately sense what people are experiencing internally, when you can catch the sadness beneath the brave face, the anxiety beneath the bravado, the genuine warmth beneath the professional reserve, your relationships change in a fundamental way. You become, for the people in your life, someone who actually sees them. Not just their words and their presented surface, but their real emotional reality in the moment. This experience of being genuinely seen is one of the deepest needs human beings have, and one of the rarest experiences they actually receive. People don't always know why they trust certain people more, or why certain relationships feel more real and less performed. But a significant part of it is this. Those are the relationships where they feel their actual experience is being met by the other person, not just their stated experience. Your growing behavioral literacy makes you that person more and more reliably. The self-awareness dividend. One of the unexpected gifts of deep behavioral literacy is self-knowledge. As you develop sensitivity to the behavioral signals of others, you inevitably begin to apply that same lens to yourself. You start noticing your own micro-expressions in moments of stress. You catch your own vocal shift when a conversation moves toward a topic that makes you anxious. You notice when your posture is closed, or when you've been directing your feet away from someone for the last 5 minutes. You observe the deviations from your own baseline and ask what they're telling you about your internal state. This self-observational capacity, watching yourself with the same calibrated attention you give others, is one of the highest forms of emotional intelligence. It allows you to communicate more deliberately, manage your own behavioral signals in high-stakes situations, and develop a level of self-awareness that most people simply never achieve. The teacher's multiplier. At some point in your development, you'll find that explaining these concepts to others, teaching them what you've learned, dramatically deepens your own understanding. Teaching forces precision. When you have to explain why a particular cluster means what you think it means, you discover whether you actually understand the principle or simply pattern matched from observation. When a student challenges your interpretation or asks a question you can't immediately answer, you identify the edges of your own knowledge. Find people around you who are interested in human behavior and share what you're learning. The teaching relationship accelerates your mastery while expanding the reach of these skills into other lives, technology, evolution, and the future of reading people. Human behavioral signals will evolve as communication platforms evolve. The rise of video communication has created new behavioral contexts. The normalization of text-based emotional communication has created new behavioral channels. Artificial intelligence and deepfakes create new challenges to visual behavioral reading. Virtual reality will create entirely new interaction environments. The foundational principles in this book, that emotions create involuntary physiological responses, that everyone has a baseline and deviations are meaningful, that context governs interpretation, and that clusters rather than single signals produce reliable readings. These principles will remain as true in new technological contexts as they are in face-to-face conversation, because they're rooted not in any particular communication medium, but in the basic architecture of the human nervous system. That architecture isn't changing. What changes is the medium through which it expresses itself. The final principle: humility as mastery. The truly expert behavior reader holds their readings with genuine, calibrated humility, not false modesty, not, "oh, I could be completely wrong," as a reflexive disclaimer that actually means nothing. Genuine epistemic humility that recognizes behavioral analysis produces probabilistic hypotheses, not certainties. The most skilled practitioners in the most controlled research conditions achieve accuracy rates in the 70 to 85% range. In the messy, context-rich, emotionally complex reality of actual human life, that number is variable. You will be wrong. You will misread someone's anxiety as deception. You will miss contempt masked by a convincing social smile. You will interpret a cultural norm as a personal signal. You will project your own state onto someone else's behavior. These errors are not failures. They're data. They show you specifically where your calibration needs adjustment. The behavior reader who makes mistakes and learns from them is developing real expertise. The behavior reader who never registers their errors is building increasingly confident incompetence. Hold your readings as hypotheses. Test them against additional information. Revise when evidence contradicts. Maintain the scientist's willingness to be wrong in service of eventually being right. Where you go from here. You've traveled through 15 chapters of human psychology, from the evolutionary origins of behavioral leakage through micro-expression anatomy, body language clusters, vocal analysis, baseline calibration, cross-cultural interpretation, ethical application, real-world scenarios, and the compounding practice of lifelong mastery. You now see people differently than you did at the beginning. That difference will grow with every conversation, every observation, every reading you make and check and revise. The gap between you and the person who can't decode anyone, the person you were before page 1, will widen every week. Use this power generously. Use it to understand, not to exploit. Use it to connect, not to control. Use it to build the kind of relationships where people feel genuinely seen. Because in a world saturated with surface-level interaction, that is perhaps the rarest and most valuable gift one human being can offer another. The people around you are broadcasting everything. Now you know how to receive it. The 10 most powerful situations to use behavioral reading, and exactly how most people learn behavioral skills and then wonder where to apply them first. Here's your practical field guide. The 10 highest value situations where reading people accurately produces the biggest, most measurable results in your life. Situation 1. The first 90 seconds of any new meeting research suggests that first impressions form within the first few seconds of an encounter, and they're remarkably difficult to reverse once set. Understanding this, the behaviorally literate person uses the opening 90 seconds of any new meeting not to make a strong impression, but to gather critical data. In those first 90 seconds, you can establish a rough baseline, identify the other person's communication preferences, detect their comfort level with your presence, gauge their energy level and emotional state, and pick up initial signals about their personality type, all before either of you has said anything of substance. Watch the handshake. Its duration, pressure, and the angle of the palm tell you about the person's dominance orientation and comfort with physical contact. Watch the direction they initially position their body. Toward you is engagement. Slightly angled away is caution or formality. Watch their eye contact. How long they hold it before looking away tells you about their confidence level and extroversion. Then, listen to their first few sentences. Speak in pace, filler word frequency, whether they ask you a question immediately, people-oriented, or lead with information, task-oriented. By the time 90 seconds have passed, you have a preliminary behavioral map that will guide your entire interaction. Situation 2. When someone says, "I'm fine," this might be the single most common deception in everyday life. Not malicious deception, but social deception. The "I'm fine" that means, "I'm not fine, but I don't want to get into it right now." The behavioral cluster that accompanies a socially performed "I'm fine" is usually brief verbal delivery, no elaboration offered, a slight downward break in eye contact immediately after the statement, a micro-tightening of the lips before settling into a neutral expression, and possibly a behavioral redirect, immediately pivoting the conversation to something else, or moving physically away. The ethically important response to this cluster isn't to press and force disclosure. It's to create an opening. "I hear you, and I'm here if you ever want to talk." Then let it go. You've acknowledged that you see them, which is what they need, without forcing them to be more vulnerable than they're ready to be. Situation 3. Evaluating. Whether to trust someone. New trust evaluation is perhaps the most consequential application of behavioral reading, because trusting the wrong people in business, romance, or friendship has enormous costs, and the signals are almost always there to be read if you know what to look for. The most reliable trust signals are consistency and alignment. Trustworthy people's verbal and nonverbal channels align. They look and sound the way you'd expect someone to look and sound when saying what they're saying. Their behavior is consistent across contexts. They treat waitstaff the same way they treat VIPs. Their stories are consistent across time. The details don't shift when they tell you the same thing twice. The most reliable distrust signals are inconsistency and misalignment. Verbal content that doesn't match vocal tone or facial expression. Stories that shift in detail between tellings. Different behavioral presentations in different social contexts. Charming to people who can help them, dismissive to people who can't. Early relationship flattery that exceeds what the depth of the relationship warrants. These patterns individually could have innocent explanations. In clusters, they warrant caution. Situation 4. The performance review or difficult feedback conversation. Giving difficult feedback is one of the most emotionally challenging communication tasks in professional life. And behavioral reading transforms how effectively you can do it. Before you begin the substantive conversation, establish the person's baseline during a few minutes of normal interaction. Note their default behavioral state when they're comfortable. As you begin to introduce the difficult content, watch their regulatory behaviors. Do they start breathing differently? Does their posture shift? Do self-soothing behaviors appear? These signals tell you how the feedback is landing emotionally, separate from their composed verbal response. Watch especially for the gap between their verbal acknowledgement and their behavioral response. I appreciate the feedback. This is really helpful, accompanied by a slight backward lean, reduced eye contact, and crossed arms tells you that the verbal acceptance is social performance. The emotional reality is defensiveness or hurt. Address the emotional reality directly. I want to make sure this feels constructive and fair to you, not just critical. Before continuing, the most productive, difficult conversations happen when the giver can calibrate delivery in real time, based on the receiver's actual emotional state, not their performed response. Situation 5. Reading a room you've just walked into, whether it's a party, a boardroom, a family dinner, or a networking event. The ability to rapidly read the social dynamics of a room you've just entered gives you enormous navigational advantage. First scan, spatial positioning. Who's at the center of the most active clusters? Who's in the peripheral positions? The spatial hierarchy often reflects the social or status hierarchy. Second scan, behavioral energy. What's the room's overall energy level? High, moderate, subdued? Are there pockets of high engagement and pockets of low engagement? What's different about them? Third scan, body language pairs and triads. In any conversation cluster, who's mirroring whom? Who's oriented toward whom? Who's angled slightly away? These microdynamics tell you the relationship dynamics within each group. Fourth scan, entry responses. When you entered the room, who noticed? Who's still periodically glancing toward you? Whose attention didn't shift at all? The pattern of attention responses tells you something about the social dynamics of the room relative to you specifically. By the time you've done all 4 scans, which takes about 2 minutes, you have a working map of the room's social landscape. Situation 6, the sales or persuasion moment. Whether you're selling a product, pitching an idea, asking for a raise, or persuading someone toward a decision, behavioral reading transforms your effectiveness by replacing guesswork with real-time feedback. The single most valuable behavioral skill in any persuasion scenario is tracking engagement versus disengagement signals and adjusting your approach in real time rather than delivering a prepared presentation to its conclusion, regardless of what the other person is doing. Engagement signals, leaning forward, open posture, eye contact that's attentive rather than polite, the appearance of genuine curiosity in the facial expression, follow-up questions that go deeper. When you see these, you've found the nerve. Go deeper there. Disengagement signals, postural retreat, phone awareness. Even if they don't pick it up, you'll notice their attention drift toward what? Eyes going slightly unfocused, shorter and more obligatory responses. When you see these, stop and ask a question rather than continuing to push. What's your reaction to what I've shared so far? Re-engage before you continue. The most common mistake in sales and persuasion, misreading polite engagement as genuine engagement and continuing to present until the other person either buys out of social obligation or says no just to end the interaction. Situation 7. Parenting a child who doesn't want to talk about it. Children, especially adolescents, frequently lack both the vocabulary and the willingness to articulate their internal experiences verbally. This doesn't mean those experiences aren't written clearly in their behavior. Behavioral changes are typically the first indicator of a developing problem. A previously outgoing child who becomes quieter and more withdrawn. An adolescent whose friend group suddenly changes in eating or sleep patterns that show up in appearance and energy. A drop in the animated quality of daily interaction, the behavioral flatness that signals either depression or significant preoccupation. With children, the ethical application of behavioral reading is particularly important. The goal is always to create safety, not to interrogate. When you notice behavioral changes, the effective approach is to create context. Physical activities done together, car rides, where the side-by-side rather than face-to-face positioning reduces the pressure of direct conversation. And open-ended, non-threatening verbal overtures, rather than direct confrontation that produces defensiveness. I've noticed you seem like you have something on your mind lately. I'm here whenever you feel like talking is more effective and more accurate behaviorally than, "What's wrong with you? You haven't been yourself." Situation 8. Evaluating leaders and authority figures. Most people defer to authority with insufficient critical evaluation. Behavioral reading changes this dynamic. It allows you to assess leaders, authority figures, and experts based on what their behavior reveals rather than simply accepting what they tell you about themselves. The most reliable behavioral markers of genuine leadership capability. Authentic confidence without dominance performance. Truly confident leaders don't need to claim space aggressively or interrupt frequently. Their authority rests comfortably, which makes them physically comfortable. Genuine curiosity about others. Leaders who are secure in their authority show authentic interest in the people around them. Their eye contact during others speaking is engaged rather than impatient. They ask follow-up questions that couldn't have been scripted in advance. Consistent behavioral treatment across status levels. How someone treats people who can do nothing for them is among the most reliable character signals available. Watch what happens in the behavioral interaction between a supposedly impressive person and a waiter, a parking attendant, a custodian. Behavioral alignment between stated values and observed behavior. The person who says, "We're all equals here," and then consistently dominates all meeting decisions and takes the most prominent physical position in every space, is demonstrating a significant misalignment between verbal content and behavioral reality. Situation 9. The long distance or digital relationship. Reading people through digital channels requires adapted skills, but the underlying principles are the same. In text communication, the behavioral signals shift from physical to linguistic. Response timing, message length, punctuation choices, word selection formality, the specific words chosen to describe emotional states. Just as in person, the key is change from pattern. Someone who suddenly becomes much more formal or much shorter in their messages, or who begins responding after long delays when they previously responded quickly, is showing you something worth attending to. In video communication, the full behavioral toolkit applies, but with some modifications. Upper body management is heightened because people know they're being observed. But the same micro-expressions occur. The same vocal patterns apply. And interestingly, one of the most revealing behavioral signals becomes visible in video that's sometimes missed in person. The direction of the person's gaze during processing. Where do they look when they're thinking? Where do they look when they're uncomfortable? Background choices in video calls are genuinely informative. The person who consistently shows a highly curated, professional background is telling you something about their self-presentation priorities. The person who uses their actual living space is signaling comfort with intimacy and authenticity. Neither is better. Both are data. Situation 10. Reading yourself in high-stakes moments. The ultimate application of behavioral reading is the ability to observe your own signals in real time and adjust them. In high-stakes situations, presentations, negotiations, difficult conversations, job interviews, your own behavioral signals communicate as much to others as theirs do to you. If you're nervous, your voice will rise, your rate will increase, your gestures will become smaller and more self-soothing. If you're feeling defensive, your posture will close. If you're feeling contemptuous, that micro-expression will flash, and people will feel it even if they can't consciously identify it. The self-aware behavioral communicator can catch these signals in themselves and make conscious adjustments. Slow the breathing to reset the vocal cords. Adopt open posture to trigger the neurological cascade that shifts emotional state. Deliberately slow speech rate to project confidence. The nervous system is temporarily not feeling. This isn't performance or deception, it's regulation. Using your understanding of the mind-body relationship to manage your own state so that your external presentation more accurately reflects the competence and values you actually possess. Master that, and you've come full circle. From reading others, to reading yourself, to managing the entire conversation from the inside out.